Boker Tov. Good morning. This is our third encounter together, and as you're getting to know me rabbinically, there's something you may or may not have noticed about my temperament. And Matt has encouraged me to share this with you outright. It's nothing serious, it's nothing terminal or idolatrous, but I should disclose to you sooner than later that I'm a little bit Buddhist. Okay, maybe not a little, maybe a lot. It's more than a flirtation. It's been an ongoing affair of many years. In general, I'm a deeply interfaith kind of guy. I've always enjoyed studying scriptures and visiting houses of worship of all faiths. And these learnings have been indispensable to my rabbinic formation. Quaker Meeting House has been very seminal, second only to Zen Buddhism, like most secular Reform Jews who went to liberal arts college. It's possible that Jews were already doing Zen thousands of years ago, as it's written in the Mishnah that the Hasidim HaRishonim, the earliest pious ones, would shohin, they would wait for an hour before and an hour after praying. Rashi interpreted this waiting as meditation. And Philo, in his journal on the Therapeutae, a Jewish monastic sect outside Alexandria, writes at length on how they spent their days meditating in solitude. The most spiritually formative chapter of my life was an apprenticeship for half a year at a monastery called Green Gulch Farm Zen Center in Northern California. For brevity's sake, I'll try to describe Green Gulch with a haiku. I chop chard at dawn, sit, smell moss, hear waves, roses. Emerald light on lichen. Because I'm not Buddhist, but Buddhish, and therefore verbose, my haikus have an extra syllable. I want to share with you one topical insight from my time at Green Gulch. 5 amazing words that my boss, Jeff, once said to me. After college, I felt professionally called towards food, so I'd spend many months volunteering on farms, avidly reading the gastronomy classics, staging, i.e. working for free, at fine restaurants, and home cooking for friends incessantly. I came to Green Gulch for its monastic training as much as its kitchen, which has been the breeding ground for a number of the greatest vegetarian farm-to-table chefs. One evening, the head chef, Jeff, and I were drinking tea and talking, and he said these 5 wild words to me. The weird thing is, Jeff spontaneously left Green Gulch the next day to go care for his dying mother overseas. Has that happened to any of you before? That a pivot point of advice came not from close friends or family, but from a brief encounter with a near stranger? It's funny how that happens. I was telling Jeff of how I'd been trying to figure out if food was my vocation or my avocation, and then he said these 5 words. Maybe you just want reverence. Maybe you just want reverence. You don't hear that word much anymore. Reverence. It's taken on such a tenor of earnestness that we only use it for hyperbole. Something like, oh, little Johnny really looks up to his older brother. He practically reveres him. Perhaps, like many of you, I had 3 classic criteria for my career search. Something I'm passionate about, something that serves others' needs, and something that pays the bills. But Jeff's 5 words uprooted my long-held notion of categorizing time into work time and playtime. I was struck that maybe the reason we're very briefly here on earth is not necessarily to change the world or be happy or find success, but to every day pursue an ever greater reverence for the inconceivably numerous and numinous wonders deeply woven into our mundane that we never asked for, that we were just given, and which we all too easily take for granted. I'm telling you all this because I think we need to understand reverence in order to understand sacrifice. And we need to understand sacrifice in order to understand Leviticus. And we need to understand Leviticus in order to grasp the sensibility of Yom Kippur. And that's today. We read earlier from the book of Leviticus, which many people think is the most boring book of the Bible, but that's simply not true. Chronicles is the most boring. Chronicles, the last book of Torah, which basically retells everything we already learned, but in much less interesting prose, is the most potent sleep aid yet invented by mankind. Yes, Chronicles are older and more potent than any dose of melatonin or Xanax. Anyhow, Leviticus is a comprehensive manual for animal sacrifice. And I think about animal sacrifice a lot. Probably too much. I ponder it because we moderns often look at sacrifice from a cold, anthropological distance. Sacrifice was this archaic institution that was done way back when for God knows why, and boy do we know how. And those people, they had a narrower understanding of how the world works. So when we became more informed and enlightened and less barbarous, we stopped sacrificing. In the history of Judaism, there's a consensus that after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, our central altar, the rabbis replaced sacrifice with prayer, which could be done in any place. And this rabbinic innovation was revolutionary. That said, I don't buy that for two reasons. First, oral prayer is not spiritual equivalent to animal sacrifice. Singing and chanting blessings to God, as we've done today, is great, but it doesn't perform the same might of spiritual efficacy as publicly setting a flame and then eating your most valuable financial asset in public. Here's how I picture a contemporary equivalent. Imagine the CEO of Trader Joe's is a member of Brooklyn Jews, our MVM, most valuable mocker, and 90% of his assets are frozen. Literally, as in 90% of his capital comprises frozen food. Once a year, he fasts and begs to God for atonement all day, and for the big finale of his renunciation, he sets an entire Trader Joe's franchise on fire, and then invites us all to break fast on the previously frozen, now perfectly cooked banquet. Can you imagine that? The second reason I don't buy the prayer replacement theory is that animal sacrifice was a universal institution of antiquity, one of, if not the only, in Mesopotamia, China, indigenous America, Greece and Rome, India, and beyond. Every large and complex human civilization devised elaborate procedures for animal sacrifice. For me, this begs the question, what primal human need, what itch did sacrifice scratch? And with what do we scratch that same itch today? Or, if we don't scratch that itch, what are the consequences? And, most prescient, is it possible that the big, intractable issues of our time, climate change, economic inequity, imperial violence, mass incarceration. From here onwards, I'll refer to all of these in shorthand as our great Cirrus. Might any of these stem from our unmet primal need for sacrifice? Now, I'm not the first person to recreationally ponder sacrifice's less obvious motives. In the 12th century, Maimonides wrote in his Guide for the Perplexed that sacrifice was a holdover from pre-monotheistic idol worship. And because sacrifice was so baked in already to Israelite culture, God decided it would be easier to redirect animal sacrifices solely in service of him, rather than forbid the entire institution. In Maimonides' view, sacrifice was always transitional, a divine compromise in preparation for eventual oral prayer, which we do today. French philosopher Georges Bataille called sacrifice a sacred economy. We traded deliberate excess for awe, and in modernity, we've replaced that with endless accumulation. Another philosopher, René Girard, has a complementary theory, the scapegoat mechanism. He argues that sacrifice was a way to channel inherent human violence. Other theorists propose that sacrifice has been replaced by glorified warfare and nationalism, the tribalism of professional sports, even certain kinds of theater in which artists sacrifice themselves onto the stage, or the communal feast. I have a hunch that most of you probably attended Thanksgiving meal last year in which turkey was served. According to Jonathan Safran Foer's We Are the Weather, 96% of American families eat turkey on Thanksgiving, making it our most common civic activity. That beats out voting, reading, even toothbrushing by an incredible margin. And I think this might explain a few things about our great nation. The sheer enormity of turkeys we kill and consume on Thanksgiving makes Leviticus's one sacrificial goat look like chopped liver. are we really so different from them? In any case, there's no one explanation for sacrifice, but on Yom Kippur, I'd like to focus on a particular function that I believe is related to our great service, reverence. The first verse of today's Torah portion reads, "Vadaber Hashem a Moshe acharei mot shnei bnei Aharon bekarvatam lifnei Hashem vayamutu." God spoke to Moses after the death of Aaron's two sons, who died when they drew too close to God. I want to draw your attention to two phrases here. The first is kravtam, a form of korban, the Hebrew word for sacrifice. Its root is karov, which means to draw close to. In this sense, the korbanot, the sacrifices of Leviticus, don't mean to give something up. The best translation for korban is intimacy. Once you get past the graphic nature of Leviticus, at its heart, it's a book about a fellowship of estranged people trying desperately to speak a love language that's impossibly foreign. To note, for most of Jewish history, children studied Leviticus first, which is strange. Genesis seems like the obvious place to begin. In the 5th century commentary, Leviticus Rabbah, Rabbi Asi explains that the crux of Leviticus is tahor, purity. And because children are pure and korban, intimacy, are pure, it is only fitting that children occupy themselves with purity. The second phrase I want to draw attention to is acharei mot, also the name of this parasha. Judaism says little about the afterlife, but it says much about the after death, acharei mot. I propose that if the afterlife is a theory of what happens to us during the eternity on the latter side of a lifespan, then the after death is a periodic rehearsal of eternity within a lifespan. That's Yom Kippur. In this text, Aaron goes through a role change that initiates today's rituals. Prior to acharei mot, he has served as the keynote speaker to the Israelites. God commands and revelates to Moses. Moses, of poor speech, tells Aaron what to say, and Aaron broadcasts the message. In this way, Aaron has always been a walking paradox. He does all of the talking, but he has never once spoken his own words. He is the picket signs with tried and true slogans, the door-to-door canvassing scripts targeted for a neighborhood's demographic, the talking points of a morning news interview. Or, to put it another way, God is the world's expanse of information. Moses is the laptop connected to Wi-Fi, and Aaron is ChatGPT. Acharei mot, after the death of his two sons, Aaron is infamously silent, stupefied. A more accurate translation of the word used in that passage, vayidom, might be awed into speechlessness. It's finally Aaron's moment to speak his own words, and he's muted by remote astonishment. But then, instead of talking the talk, he walks the walk by heeding the elaborate instructions of the first Yom Kippur and its mighty goat sacrifice. Aaron's changing career coincides with an Israelite changing consciousness. Aaron goes from mindless words to intentional, tacit action. Animal sacrifice, fasting, refraining from bathing, attending shul, unlike words, unlike sermons, these rituals cannot be performative. A person cannot fast more eloquently or convincingly than another. The reward of fasting is, well, the experience of fasting, just as the reward of reverence is reverence itself. I posit that Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus form and recount a dialectical history, thesis, antithesis, then synthesis, of how a group consciousness, that of the Israelites, came to be. Genesis, the thesis, is all about abundance. God creates the cosmos, Abraham fathers a people who outnumber the stars. Jacob launches the 13 tribes, Joseph turns Egyptian famine into surplus, and so on. Notice, unlike prophets of other major religions, the patriarchs of Genesis are not ascetics, such that their spiritual grandeur rises in direct correlation with their economic prosperity. Exodus, the antithesis, is all about scarcity. Pharaoh oppresses the Hebrews not for their creed or culture, but for one reason. It's stated, because they are too numerous. Every step of their revolution requires giving something up. And when they're finally free, they enter the Midbar, which doesn't mean desert, but wasteland. Leviticus is the synthesis of Genesis's abundance and Exodus's scarcity. It codifies the sustainability institution of sacrifice. In short, Genesis is creation, Exodus is conservation, and Leviticus is creative destruction. This all might seem abstract and literary, but I beg, it couldn't be more practical. Louis C.K. has a story of being on an airplane some years ago when, right before takeoff, the pilot announced that they could use Wi-Fi in the air. This was a first. Who would have ever thought it possible to use Wi-Fi on a plane? Then, no less than an hour later, the pilot said that they're having some trouble with the Wi-Fi connection. And the guy behind Louis C.K. groaned, it's ridiculous. How do you already feel entitled to this thing that you didn't know existed until this morning? Now, I've spent much of my life studying the root causes of our great cirrus. You could point your finger at a few slimy billionaire CEOs. You could put your finger at the imperialist, racist, capitalist, etc., patriarchy. You could point your finger at God, or you could point your finger at the death of God and countless others. There's no single right target, but I, as clergy to be, point the finger at myself. And I urge you to, as well, not to blame ourselves, but to empower ourselves. In light of Louis C.K.'s story, I don't think it's reductive to suggest that the ills of our great cirrus share a common cause: our ever-expanding consciousness of entitlement, one that is swelled to such enormity that we, members of the post-capitalist West, bear demands that exceed the supply of what the market, the earth, and international labor can produce without exploitation. To address our great cirrus, we must attract our consciousness of entitlement, the one that asks, how much more could we have? And expand our consciousness of reverence, the one that asks, how much more could we not have? How much less do we deserve? And in turn, after destroying your choicest flock, you'll actually have more pleasure, more bounty, because prosperity has no correlation with how much we possess. Rather, as Pirkei Avot tells us, happy is one who is satisfied with their lot. And I think if we sacrificed more, we would waste a whole lot less. Jews have always been a deeply interfaith kind of people. Historians call this syncretism. Genesis shares nearly identical myths with Mesopotamia and Canaan. In the first century, theologians like Philo incorporate Greek and Stoic philosophy into Jewish thought. In medieval Spain and North Africa, Jews and Muslims wrote and recited sacred poetry together at courtyard salons. From the Renaissance to the 19th century, Jewish and Christian mystics were in constant, rigorous dialogue. And American Reformed Judaism was really made in the image of Protestant Christianity. I can name many more examples, but the important thing is that syncretism is never copy and paste. You could say that the Jews organically integrated their neighbors' ideas, but what syncretism really does is it draws out something golden that is already present within Judaism and has fallen by the wayside over time. Jubus, Jewish Buddhists, are numerous because we're thirsty for a contemplative, God-intimate offering of Judaism, which I believe died in the Shoah. Many friends asked if I would talk about politics today. Originally, I said no. But now I realize just how political this sermon is. Because even though it will never make headlines, your greatest political contribution to the outer world will be the ego that you sacrifice in your inner world. I really believe, I really do, that a more monastic kind of Judaism, a shift like that of Aaron, seeking divine intimacy via intentional destruction, this could cure our great cirrus. I don't yet know exactly how. but I would love to be thought partners with you all, ritual partners, a modern-day fellowship of priests, in figuring out how to harness the neglected genius of Korban for our time and place. We won't have answers tomorrow, but to move towards a more expansive, Levitical kind of consciousness, starting right now, in this year to come, with all tsuris and beauty and mystery and delight and horror and blossom and blossom. What if, maybe, just maybe, you were to just want reverence and nothing more? Tzom Shalem v'Gamar Chatama Tova b'Sefer Chaim. May you have not an easy fast, but a fast that completes you. And may all of your names be written in the really, really, really good book of life.